In my past two videos, I've been going over alcohol in the Bible and whether or not it was alcoholic or not, and how that relates to drinking in moderation, whether or not drinking itself is a sin. In the first video I did on this, we went over 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 3 to explain why that verse is not banning drinking in moderation. In this second video we went over some biblical verses to see what the Bible says about drinking, specifically in moderation, or about drinking as a whole. And now in this video, we're going to dive deep into the ancient context to explain the history of the time to show why it's nearly impossible to say that the wine in the ancient times could possibly be non-alcoholic. To do that, we're going to be diving into the two wine theory. This is the theory that when in the Bible, whenever there is discussion of a wine that is good, it is non-alcoholic, and when there's discussion of a wine that is bad, that it is alcoholic. This is the way that people get around the fact that wine is looked at many times as being a good thing, or as we looked at in the past video, how they can try and explain the fact that wine was implemented and used in the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, communion. So the first place we're going to look when talking about this stuff is looking at the context of the time and how wine was made. So in the environment, especially in the environment of where the Bible was written, there is a lot of natural yeasts and such that will rest on the grapes whenever they are harvested. What this means is that as soon as the grapes are crushed, fermentation automatically begins because the sugars and the yeast will interact, and from there fermentation will start. And within days, it is already completed or nearing completion. We're going to get into sources in a second, but that's the first point I want to make, is that when grapes are crushed, especially this is really important for ancient times, fermentation was already starting. And so that wasn't already, you couldn't say that it was grape juice automatically right away because of that, because as soon as they're crushed, it's already beginning the process of becoming wine, becoming more than just grape juice. The article Fermentation Management Practices from UC Davis states the following: the time following harvest and fruit processing at which an inclement is added can impact the flora present during the fermentation. At crush, the juice or must will contain large populations of bacteria and non-Saccharomyces yeasts. These microbes will be able to initiate growth under anaerobic conditions, and were it not for the competition from Saccharomyces and production of toxic end products, would be able to persist in the fermentation. The non-Saccharomyces yeasts generate a broad spectrum of aromatic compounds and produce hydrophilic enzymes that may release bound aromatic components of the grape. They do not have the ethanol and stress tolerance of Saccharomyces to so rarely complete a fermentation, depending upon the organism present. If non-Saccharomyces characters are desired in the wine, there are two options available. Commercial preparations of non-Saccharomyces yeasts exist and can be used to boost numbers of desired organisms prior to domination by Saccharomyces. However, this is not the same as an indigenous or native fermentation, as this practice is equivalent to the use of commercial Saccharomyces preparations. And then Penn Museum has an article called The Beginnings of Winemaking and Viniculture in the Ancient Near East and Egypt. And this, they state in this article, as the grapes are gradually eaten over the next day or two, this juice will ferment, owing to the natural yeast bloom on the skins, and become a low alcohol wine, reaching the bottom of the barrel. Our imagined caveman or woman will sample the concoction and be pleasantly surprised by the aromatic and mildly intoxicating beverage. So what we see there is that in the first article, these types of yeasts and such would automatically start to ferment the wine as soon as it was crushed. And that there's two stages to it. One of them would begin the fermentation, the other one would finish it. And in the modern day and commercial settings, if you want to extend that very first part, you can now add commercial, like your own ones. But that does make it different from the natural fermentation, where there's sort of a two-step process, one to kickstart it and the other one to carry it further. And then the second article, we saw that even within just a few days, and you can find this all over the place, this isn't unique to just this article, there's a lot of other places that will explain this, within just a few days, the wine was already alcoholic. And it would take, if you wanted to extend it, a few weeks, a few months, it would become more and more alcoholic. But just in those first few days, it was already alcoholic. Maybe the comparison today would be something like a light beer. but a beer nonetheless. Going right off of that, something that ties into this really importantly actually has to do with the heat, and specifically how hot it is whenever the grapes are crushed and when the fermentation begins. If you are in a warmer climate or a hotter climate, fermentation is going to happen at a much more rapid pace compared to a cooler climate. So why this is important is because in the ancient Near East, or in the East where the Bible is set, they are live in a warm climate with temperatures between 75 and 95 degrees. And as we're about to look at, this means that this is the perfect condition for grape juice to start ferment into wine at a very quick pace. In his article, Home Manufacture and Use of Unfermented Grape Juice, George C. Husband writes, and I believe he was writing this for the Department of Agriculture, but he writes, "It is well known that grapes and other fruits, when ripe, have the invisible spores of various fungi, yeasts, and bacteria adhering to their skins and stems. When dry, these spores are inert, but after the grapes are crushed and the spores are immersed in the juice, they become active and begin to multiply. If the juice is warm, the changes take place rapidly. If, on the other hand, it is cool, the change is slower. But in either case, if left alone, the organisms increase until the juice ferments. The most favorable temperature for fermentation is between 65 degrees and 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold checks, but does not kill, the ferment. This fermentation, now commonly called the elliptic yeast, changes the sugar in the grape to alcohol and carbonic acid gas, and is the leading factor in converting must into wine. Hence, it will be readily seen that to keep grape juice sweet, fermentation must be prevented, and to be salable, the product must be clear, bright, and attractive." So we see that the warm climate where the Bible was written, in the East, where it was set at, we see that the temperatures would have been perfect, in the perfect ideal conditions for this rapid fermentation to take place, which explains why it seems to have so quickly become alcohol in just a few days, and why over time the wine would become more and more alcoholic. And this is the second part of this very important point, because the other important thing to note is that the time in which the grapes are harvested to when Passover would occur was a very big gap. It was about 6-month gap. If wine was already becoming wine from crushed grapes in just 3 days, then imagine how much more fermented or how much more alcoholic it was by the time that 6-month mark hit and Passover would begin, and people would begin to partake of this wine in the Passover. And very specifically, the early Christians would have done this in fulfilling the Passover, just as Christ instituted at the Lord's Supper, or partaking of the Eucharist. And Christ himself would have been drinking this fermented wine at the Passover. If you want to get into this stuff deeper, you want to challenge that, I recommend you go back to my past video where I go over all this more. I don't want to get into too deep, but I will mention something that I'm gonna mention here because it kind of has to do with this stuff. Whereas the last video, I mentioned it because it has to do with scripture as well. But if you want a fuller explanation of this, please go to the last video. But for now, I just want to make it known that the fruit of the vine, as is expressed in scripture, is an idiom, a Jewish idiom, that Jesus would have known about because it was around in the 1st century at his time, that was used to describe wine. Very specifically, the fruit of the vine is wine. If you want to see sources on that, defense of that, go see the last video. But again, this 6-month gap that we see from Passover, and the fact that the grapes are crushed right away, that the fermentation happens rapidly in these warm climates, and then that over the extended period of time it would only grow in fermentation, shows us that the early Christians and the Jews would have been partaking of alcoholic fermented wine. So I want to move away from that. And again, guys, just please remember, this is not an in-depth coverage of any of these topics. You can go very deep into these to show the history of wine. You can go read entire books about this. That's not the goal of this video. The goal of the video is to give you just like a few points in a few different sections to show that it's almost crazy to say that the wine at the time could have been non-alcoholic or non-fermented. But the next way I want to go about showing this is actually going to go back to the sources of early Christians to read what they had to say about this stuff. And so to do that, we're going to look at 3 early church fathers read some quotes from them, and then basically just go over them a little bit. The first quote we're going to have here is from Clement of Alexandria in the Pedagogus, I always say that wrong, Book 2, Chapter 2. In this he says, quote, "In what manner do you think the Lord drank when he became man for our sakes? As shamelessly as we? Was it not with decorum and propriety? Was it not deliberately? For rest assured, he himself also partook of wine, for he too was man. And he blessed the wine, saying, Take, drink, this is my blood, the blood of the vine. He figuratively calls the word shed for many for the remission of sins, the holy stream of gladness. And that he who drinks ought to observe moderation. He clearly showed by what he taught at feasts. For he did not teach affected by wine, and that it was wine which was the thing blessed. He showed again when he said to his disciples, I will not drink of the fruit of this vine till I drink it with you in the kingdom of my Father. But that it was wine which was drunk by the Lord, he tells us again when he spoke concerning himself, reproaching the Jews for their hardness of heart. For the Son of Man, he says, came, and they say, Behold, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of publicans. Let this be held fast by us against those who are called the Anacretites. Now, two quick things I want to mention. I also went over that verse about them accusing Jesus of being a drunkard to show why the wine he was drinking was alcoholic. And then at the end there, I did that in the last video if you're interested. And at the end there, the Anacretites, this was an early sect of heretical Christians, either involved with Gnostics or their own thing. It's not really clear. Regardless, they were heretical, who believed that they were only to partake of the Lord's Supper using water, no wine. And then the next quote, the reason I mention that is because the next quote is actually going to be from them as well, or about them as well. And St. Cyprian of Carthage, in his Epistle 62, writes the following, Know then that I have been admonished that in offering the cup, the tradition of the Lord must be observed, and that nothing must be done by us but what the Lord first did on our behalf, as that the cup which is offered in remembrance of him should be offered mingled with wine. For when Christ says, I am the true vine, the blood of Christ is assuredly not water, but wine. Neither can his blood by which we are redeemed and quickened appear to be in the cup, when in the cup there is no wine whereby the blood of Christ is shown forth, which is declared by the sacrament and testimony of all the scriptures. Again, we're seeing that here they're saying, hey, you have to use the wine because that's what was instituted by Christ. You're not supposed to use water. And in both these verses, we see hints, that this wine was absolutely alcoholic. There's no mention here or notion of the fact that it's not alcoholic. And in fact, in this previous one, as Clement of Alexandria was talking about, he's making clear to say that we are to partake of this, but we are to do it what? In moderation, to observe moderation in it. We are not to drink to the place where we are drunk. So that is why, again, it's going to show that it's alcoholic, because there'd be no danger in getting drunk off of the grape juice. And the ancient people at the time obviously knew this. And then finally, John Chrysostom in Homilies on Matthew, in his homily 57, states the following. It's a bit of a longer one, but again, it's going to be helpful. So, in homily 57, he states, For instance, I hear many say, when these excesses happen, he's talking about people becoming drunk, would there were no wine, O folly, O madness! When other men sin, dost thou find fault with God's gifts? And what great madness is this? What? Did the wine, O man, produce this evil? Not the wine, but the intemperance of such as take an evil delight in it. Say then, would there no drunkenness, no luxury? But if thou say, were there no wine, thou wilt say, going on by degrees, would there no steal because of the murderers, no night because of the thieves, no light because of the informers, no women because of the adulteries? And in a word, thou wilt destroy all. But do not so, for this is of a satanical mind. Do not find fault with the wine, but with the drunkenness. And when thou hast found this same man sober, sketch out all his unseemliness, and say unto him, Wine was given that we might be cheerful, not that we might behave ourselves unseemingly, that we might laugh, not that we might be a laughing stock, that we might be healthful, not that we might be diseased, that we might correct the weakness of our body, not cast down the might of our soul. God honored thee with the gift? Why disgrace thyself with the excess thereof? Hear what Paul saith, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake, and thine often infirmities. But if that saint, even when oppressed with disease and enduring successive sickness partook not of wine until his teacher suffered him, what excuse shall we have who are drunken in health? To him indeed he said, use a little wine for thy stomach's sake. But to each of you who are drunken he will say, use a little wine for thy fornications, thy frequent filthy talking, for the other wicked desires to which drunkenness is wont to give birth. But if ye are not willing for these reasons to abstain, at least on account of the dependencies which come of it, and the vexations, do ye abstain. For wine was given for gladness, yea, wine, so it is said, maketh glad the heart of man. But ye mar even this excellence in it. For what kind of gladness is it to be beside one's self, and to have innumerable vexations, and to see all things rolling around, and to be oppressed with giddiness, and like those that have a fever, to require some who may drench their heads with oil. Something I find interesting in that last paragraph is something that we kind of hear in normal conversation a lot, where people say you don't blame the thing that the person abused, you blame the person for abusing it, right? So you don't blame necessarily a gun in a shooting, you blame the person. We hear people, I'm sure you've heard this quote, guns don't kill people, people kill people. That's kind of the same argument he's making. He's saying you don't blame the steel as a whole for the error that people have used it in murdering. You don't blame the darkness for the thieves. You blame the thieves for being thieves, right? And so in the same way, he's saying you don't blame the wine for make people being drunk. I mean, he made sure very often in that quote to say wine is a gift from God. It's something that's not to be abused, but we are to recognize it as a gift and treat it like a gift from God as we are. Everything is a gift from God. We cannot abuse it. That's the entire point there. And again, we're seeing that there is clear context of being alcoholic there. There's no mention of a non-alcoholic wine. And the second quote on screen, the one from, I believe it was St. Cyprian of Carthage, I do want to make known that if you go there and read the source, he actually goes on both before and after that to go deeper into this, and it's actually very interesting. It's one of the, it's one I'd actually never read, and it is very, very interesting. I would recommend all of this. I'd recommend reading the Church Fathers in general, but this stuff is very interesting because we can see how they were already discussing things that are a problem today, or that are relevant today even still. So for this next part, I'm going to get into something that's actually pretty well known, and so because of that, I'm not going to put any quotes onto the screen. I do have sources for it. It's going to be down in the description below. All my sources are key. You can find them down below. But this is specifically going to be about the fact that grape juice as a shelf-stable product that would remain grape juice and not turn into wine was not a thing that was invented until the 1800s, when Thomas Welch used the pasteurization method on grape juice to maintain it being grape juice. Before that, there was no widespread method to maintaining grape juice in its form. And so Thomas Welch, and he was a Methodist, did not like wine at all. He wanted to get rid of any alcoholic beverage within the church and as a whole, actually. And remember, this is during the temperance movement of the 1800s. And so because of that, he sought out to find a way to just have grape juice plain and simple. And in that, using the pasteurization method, he was able to create a shelf-stable product. And that's why we have Welch's grape juice today. But it's something very important. This was not a thing until the 1800s. Before this, in ancient times, all the way up to this point, the church always used wine because it was not practical to have grape juice. The only way to have grape juice, and you can find a lot of articles when talking about how the history of grape juice, they'll mention this, was that people would propose, well, let's just have grapes at the church and we'll squeeze them every day before service and then we can drink that. The problem is that grapes aren't ready year-round, especially at this time. You couldn't just have grapes year-round. And so because of that, they had to find a different method. And that's what Thomas Welch did with pasteurizing the grape juice and creating Welch's grape juice. And so while that is incredibly interesting and it's very neat to think about, even he readily admitted that he was deviating from what the historical practice was. He knew that in the first century, the second, third century, everything, that it was not grape juice being used. He knew that Jesus was drinking alcoholic wine. He knew that. But he wanted to still try and find a way to get rid of the alcohol, because to him, what mattered, and what a lot of people would argue, and I don't necessarily have a problem with this argument, is that what matters in the communion, in the Eucharist, Lord's Supper, is not the alcoholic content of the wine, but rather still following the order of using grape juice, and that it does not necessarily have to be wine. I don't have a problem with people making that argument. The entire reason I'm making this video and the past videos is because I've been seeing a lot of people say that drinking in moderation is a sin, and I want to go back to show that if you're going to believe that taking a single sip of wine, for example, is a sin, then it reduces to absurdity when you consider the ancient and historical context of the time and all the way up to the 1800s. All right, so now I'm going to get into a few rapid fire objections that people typically have, and then we're going to be done here. So the first one is the pond theory. So essentially this theory was that you could take grape juice, freshly squeezed, put it into a jar, seal it, and put it into a pond, a cool pond, very, very importantly, a cool pond, and that it would preserve. So this is an interesting thing that you can read about. I think in Pliny, you can go find this and read it. I'm not going to put a quote up on the screen or anything. But what's interesting here is that Pliny readily admits that this actually isn't a long-scale solution. And even if it was the case that it eliminated all alcohol, which it did not eliminate all alcohol. It just slowed down the fermentation, as we read earlier, because of the coolness of the water and such. Even if we take that, it still was going to be alcoholic. And on top of that, what's very important to go alongside this is that typically stuff like this was not available to the average person. Typically, this is something that you'd have to see in people who are rich or in the more elite. And this very much was not something that the early Christians who were persecuted could do as easily as the rich or the elite could. And so again, this was a very fringe thing that was not widespread at all, and you just don't find, or we can't find any link between Christians doing this at all. There's no evidence at all that they ever partook in it, especially when you consider Christian or biblical texts or scriptures that are talking about the Lord's Supper and indicating drunkenness, like the text in 1 Corinthians, as we went over in the last video. And the next thing that we see is some people will say, well, they would boil the wine and get it down to being just like a syrup, and then they would rehydrate this, and then they would drink it, and the alcohol would be gone. So there's a couple problems with this. I think this is what Pliny wrote about. Actually, I think the last thing we wrote about the pond was Cato. I think this is Pliny with the dibs. But essentially, the problem here is that people would do this. They would take grape juice and boil it down to where it was a like I said, like something you could spread on bread and such, almost like a honey. But the problem is that that's exactly what they used it for. They didn't really use it as anything more than a condiment. We don't really see very much evidence, from what I can tell at all, that they would ever rehydrate this and then drink it as a drink. And even if that was the case, there's no real indication that this would prevent further fermentation from occurring as soon as the yeast would interact with the sugar that was now rehydrated. And so again, there's just no evidence we see that the Christians were doing this. You posit a lot. I see Christians a lot that posit this theory that, well, they boiled it. Well, number one, they boiled it, but they boiled it all the way down to a syrup or a condiment. They didn't boil it down to just some arbitrary number and then shut it off, and then it suddenly was no longer alcoholic. That's just not what happened. And we don't see any evidence that in early Christians' writings that they did that. We don't find any evidence that they did that in the Bible either. And on top of that, what's also really important is that we see that water is being put into wine to dilute it. And they did this because they didn't want it to be so strong. They didn't want it to be so alcoholic when they were partaking of it in the Lord's Supper. And also because the water coming out of Jesus' side on the cross is used, mixed with blood, is used in the Lord's Supper to obviously represent the fact that he did have his side pierced and water did come out. So the water mixed with the wine was the water mixed with the Lord's blood. But they did this, and there's no indication. They did this outside of there as well, at dinner parties and such. And there's no indication there that there'd be any reason for them to dilute the wine if it was a non-alcoholic wine. Now, these last two I am going to have a source for. The first one is going to be about filtration. People will claim that grapes would have been crushed, they would have had the grape juice, and they would have immediately filtered it, and that would have gotten rid of the yeast. So there's a few problems with that. Number one, I think people have a misconception of what wine crushing is. Wine crushing is not just a simple crush and you move on. The grapes get crushed down a ton. And when that happens, the yeasts are infused into the liquid, not just the skins. And so even though the yeast may rest on the skin, as we saw earlier, it would have been mixed in instantly with the liquids and such. And they would stomp around this stuff a lot, and the skins would get carried off with the liquid and all sorts of stuff. But people claim that you would filter it and catch the skins, and then so the yeast would have no chance to interact. That's just not how it worked at all. That's just not how wine crushing works. It is crushed down, the yeasts go into the liquid and then are carried off with the liquid. But some people will still claim, well, the fibers, the filters would catch the yeast. There is a big problem with that, and that is the fact that in ancient times, their cloths they were using would not have been small enough to catch yeast. And we're going to read a quote right now about that. Intestinal Laboratories has an article called "Let's Be Clear About Filtration." And in this article, we read, yeasts are typically in the range of 5 to 10 microns. So that this is not millimeters, this is microns. This is incredibly small. Bacteria are typically smaller. For example, cocci vary from 0.5 to 3 microns in diameter. Bacilli diameters range from 0.2 to 2 microns, and therefore the choice of filters does affect which microbes are eliminated. All yeast will be removed by 1 micron filters, however, bacteria will not be. This is really important to note because, guys, the fibers, the cloths of the time in the ancient world were not at all close enough to being like a micron or even 4 microns and could catch the yeast. It would have gone right through with the liquid and would have began fermentation. The filtration process was to catch the big bulky skins and such. So if you guys don't know, there's multiple ways you can go about handling this type of thing when it comes to filtration. I have made wine before. I've at least have helped make wine before. And what you'll see is you can pour a ton of grape juice in and seemingly there's not a lot of sediment. But what you'll find is after fermentation, sediment begins to settle on the bottom because even if you filter it, it'll still go through. And so that's what they're trying to do is they're trying to catch the bulk of the big skins and such here because they don't want to have to deal with all the sediment later. Nowadays, it's pretty easy. We have these filters. We have the capability of purchasing filters that are made in big warehouses or big labs to make very, very small filters that are a micron in size to catch yeast or such if we wanted to, and to catch all the grape skins. But what's very important is that at the time, these cloths they were using, the common cloths, would not have been big enough to capture yeast. All right, and for this final point, we're going to go straight into the quote, just so I can explain this real quick. So there is another objection that some people will say that the reason wine could not have possibly been alcoholic at the Passover or for Christians to drink or for Christ to have implemented the Lord's Supper with is because fermented wine is leavened and you were not allowed to eat that which was leavened on Passover, right? That's why it's unleavened bread that was partook of. Here's the problem. The leaven did not apply to wine. It applied to the 5 grains of the time. Now, I'm going to put a link down below for this specifically, but what's our source for this specifically down below, because I don't really have a quote for that. I have a quote that just supports the fact that wine was indeed drank at the Passover. But what's very important to note here is that the 5 grains that were banned in terms of you're not allowed to eat these leavened were the ones that are used to make bread. They had nothing to do with grapes at all. And so we're going to read here in Mishnah Peshkim 10:1. This is going to show that wine was indeed drank at Passover. It says, quote, "On the eve of Passover, adjacent to Mincha time, a person may not eat until dark, so that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. Even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side, as free and wealthy people recline when they eat. And the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine for the festival meal of Passover night." And this halakha applies even if the poor person is one of the poorest members of society and receives his food from the charity plate. If you want to go deeper into this type of stuff, again, we went deeper into the Passover and into the instituting of the fruit of the vine, which is the wine, in the last video. And so I'd highly encourage you to go check that out. But again, the grain is not applying to the wine. It's applying to the grains that were used in the bread to make it unleavened. I've seen this quote or this objection pop up multiple times, and it makes me scratch my head because it makes me realize people misunderstand the rule that was put in place against people partaking of certain foods and drinks during Passover. It had nothing to do with wine at all. It had to do with the 5 grains. I know this was kind of rushed a bit. I tried to just fit a lot into this small video, but I didn't want to go too deep on any of this. Again, the point of these videos is not to have like a large scale attack on people who are not a fan of drinking alcohol for religious reasons and such. As I said in my last video, I would personally recommend that Christians don't drink, or anybody be very, very cautious about drinking, because it can lead to dangerous things. But as I described in the last video, a lot of things can lead to dangerous things. We just have to know ourselves, always partake in moderation, and be very careful with how we do it. Now, I wanted to just state right off the bat, again, I didn't go deep into any of these topics. If you would like to go deeper into them, feel free to. But if we went deep into every single one of these, this video would be super long. You're going to find people argue this way or that way. My only point that I want to make is that we should be very careful what we're accusing people of sinning, or what accusing people of partaking in something that is a sin, if there is very good evidence that it isn't a sin. And I still think right now that drinking in moderation is not a sin. We don't find it in the Bible. We don't find it in the church fathers. We don't find it in the historical context. And we don't find it when taking everything in a holistic view. We find that drunkenness is a sin, that people are warned to be cautious against drinking in the Bible because it can lead to dangerous things, just like a lot of things can lead to dangerous things. Remember, in the Bible, we're warned a lot about being careful in starting on this path because it can lead to dangerous things without that thing being dangerous in the first place, right? Or without the main thing being sinful, rather, in the first place. The Bible does this quite a bit. So just remember, we have to be cautious about these things, but we also have to be cautious about what we're claiming somebody is doing and whether or not that thing is a sin. So I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to find a neat and tidy way to wrap all this up, because this is going to be the final video I make on this, at least this specific series of, or topics of it. So with that, again, thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know what you think down below. If you like the series, what you'd like to see from me next, give me some ideas, throw them out there, and I'd be happy to try and indulge them and to make some videos based off of them. Like, comment, subscribe. Again, let me know your thoughts down below. Let me know if I missed anything. Let me know if you have any additional comments on this topic. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and have a very blessed day.